My name is Jack Verrier. I'm a penetration tester at Black Hills Information Security. My talk is about taking down the client's network environment accidentally and the research that I did after that to provide data for any future incidents that may occur. So I was on a penetration test recently, and I was using standard tooling. I wasn't doing anything fancy, and our client had a network outage for about 15 minutes. And what followed was a very tense Teams meeting with executives from the client company all the way up to the CIO and some senior Black Hills representatives. And the client was very firmly of the belief that it was our responsibility for the outage. And I empathize with our clients. I don't hold it against them for thinking that. You know, if you live in a village for 10 years and you have a stranger come to the village and all of a sudden, you know, something goes missing, it's obviously the stranger that did it, you know. So I don't blame them at all, but this talk is my work after an outage to better understand the tools that I use and collect data so that if I'm in another call like that, I'll be better informed and can like rule stuff out really easily. So yeah, I'm focusing on external tools. I do mostly external testing at the moment, so I'm selfishly doing stuff that's going to help me with my work. and yeah, I'm trying to learn enough to be able to hold my own in a meeting with a client that's upset. So let's just get some stuff out of the way. I have a ton of data to present to you guys, so I'm not going to have a lot of text. It's going to be like graphs and visuals and stuff like that. So text is going to be up front. If you have any questions about the stuff that I'm presenting, just like raise your hand and we'll just, you know, answer it as we go. So what I'm not doing is I'm not doing like a deterministic analysis of each tool, right? I'm not going line by line through the source code of a tool and figuring out what it does in a PCAP on, you know, on the target server. I'm going through and I'm doing like a test. I'm measuring like the resource consumption and I'm figuring out what's happening on the client system. I'm not covering internal tools. I had to be selective about the tools that I'm focusing on. Some of the tools that I'll be discussing are used on internal engagements, but my focus is on external tools. I did all this testing in a LAN environment that I set up in my house on an ESXi server. So I'm not replicating, you know, internet-wide scale server responses, right? This is all LAN stuff. And the impact on client infrastructure that I'm talking about is not factoring in like, you know, a vulnerability scanner sends a packet and crashes an application, right? Because it's trying to exploit something, right? This is resource consumption. Two assumptions before we get started. Web servers are created equal. They are not created equal, but we kind of have to form this model for the project in order to like have some actionable insights. And then second, server response times from Apache and WordPress are similar enough to be usable for this project. To set up the test environment, I have this like monster, like a Dell Tower server that's been just only a DNS server in my house, just like heating my office for like the last 3 years. I finally had an opportunity to do something with it. So I set up 3 Linux machines. I went to DigitalOcean's one-click deploy WordPress page, and I was like, all right, what resources do they use on their default configuration? And it was like 1 CPU, and 1 gig of RAM, and I was like, well, that's way too little. So I went with something a little bit beefier as our starting system, 2 CPU cores and 4 gigs of RAM, and then I doubled it for our like middleweight system, and then I bumped it up to 8 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM for our like heavyweight one. And this is all in like an isolated LAN environment. I have a pfSense gateway isolating everything. I set up a Kali box in that environment. And then I port forwarded all the Grafana data out of those systems into Prometheus data out into a Grafana dashboard. All right, so the tools that I'm focusing on are Gobuster, Gowitness, Nessus, Nuclei, ssh-audit, and testssl. These are all tools I use every week. So I need data for when I'm using them, and I got to go before a client. And what I'm focusing on measuring for these tools and testing are CPU memory, network consumption, and then also response times. So I've got like a really simple Python script that's sending requests to the web server and measuring that round trip time. So I'm using that as kind of a proxy for page load times. Anybody have any questions before I get into it? All good? All right. Cool, so before we get started, I wanted to take like a baseline evaluation of what idle is on the computer. So this graph right here shows on 2 CPU cores, 4 gigs of RAM, 4 CPU cores, 8 gigs of RAM, and then 816, what idle looks like when you are pinging it with that Python script that's doing page requests, right? So we're looking at like 1/10 of a second response time from those servers. And this is the Grafana dashboard. So I wasn't familiar with this, so I'll assume that you're not. The top row here is instantaneous measurements of the system. So all these dials are like what it is at the moment that I took the screenshot. Look here, these are the time series sections. So this is like CPU usage. This is network traffic. This is in and out. And then over there is memory usage. So watch those as I'm going through my slides, and it'll help you understand what I'm talking about. So I probably shouldn't have started with Gobuster as the first tool. I went with way too many thread configurations, and it got way out of hand, and I did like 36 runs, and yeah, but I finished it. This is the usage that I use, and the threads that for each run, I went with 15, 50, 100, 200, 300, and 400 threads for Gobuster. And then I needed like a usable word list, so I went with the seclist raf small directories. Something that could run in a reasonable amount of time. And it ran usually in about 6 minutes. So let's kind of like throw expectations out the door about if we can evaluate like our settings based on CPU usage. Because this is like the beefiest server that I set up with just 15 threads, and it gets completely pegged for like 1.5 minutes. So it's being completely utilized. And what this looks like for page loads, so we're stepping back to the lowest weight server. This is 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. So I have on the right over there the configurations. So you have 15, 50, 100 down to 400 on the right. And you can see that 15 threads is like just hitting that idle on page response time. I should probably explain what the axes are. So what you see here is how long it takes for the request to be completed from curl. And then what you see down here is like how long the tool's been running. So this is like as the tool progresses, how long the page loads are taking. And so you can see that some tool runs are actually shorter than others. That means that Gobuster completed earlier than other tools. So this I've always wondered when I run Gobuster, am I configuring it in a way that optimizes my time? You know, is 15 threads really much slower than 50? And this actually helps show that. But check out like 50 and 100 threads here. Like you'll see over the next 3 slides that they reliably stay below 3 seconds for load time. So that's pretty good for understanding what is happening on the servers. This is like 400 and 200 and 300 up here, and it's a complete mess. The readings aren't even consistent. This is our medium server right here. All of those load times are high again. And you have 50 and 100 right here, and you can see that 15 threads on the bottom. And finally, our strongest server, we can see some of these response times come down quite a bit. 15 threads is staying the same, and then we're actually seeing the 100 threads be below 1 second response time, which is pretty nice. So takeaways. I tried to take down the server actually with 400 threads, and this is what consumption looked like. We had about like 6 minutes of just completely maxed out CPU usage. And look at, this is like megabits a second, so it gets down to like consistently 20 megabits a second over the course of what, like 5 to 10 minutes. So it's a lot, but the system didn't go down. What I found when I was running these tests, and I ran a lot of Gobuster tests, is that you're gonna see a ton of errors in your console. And that's a pretty good approximation of how the tool is running, and maybe even an analog for what's happening on the server. So I saw like a ton, like mostly error messages when I was getting up into the hundreds of threads here. They didn't really make it, it doesn't make sense to run that tool that high, and so it's kind of expected. But when you start seeing errors, you're either hitting a WAF or something's going on in the end system or on your local system. That brings up a good point though. I did not configure WAFs for any of the servers here. So for folks that are looking at this and wanting to protect their systems from Gobuster attacks, implementing a WAF is a really great way to do that. And then finally, running 50 to 100 threads resulted in a pretty consistent like 1 to 3 second additional response time for Gobuster. The next tool I tested was Gowitness. I'm assuming knowledge of these tools, but I should probably give like a 1 or 2 sentence about each one of them. Gowitness is like a headless server visiting tool that takes screen captures of the web servers and then gives you a nice dashboard at the end of that that you can view. So I set up these web servers, and I went with like this plugin on WordPress where you can come up with like garbage fake pages, and I came up with 25 of them. So that's what each web server has. But somehow that ended up to be like 80 unique paths and 150 total items about on the input list. So I tested Gowitness with 10, 50, and 100 threads, and I provided the input list that's specific to each server. So this is what it looks like. I threw all 3 threads on here, and this is for the 2 CPU, 4 gig RAM server. 100 threads is like wildly unpredictable. It just does not function at all. Like you see, it looks like the tool freezes for a good like 80% of the runtime, and then finally you just get a bunch of garbage, and then it terminates. So at least that's what happened for me. So I don't recommend 100 threads. But you can see down here that server response times for both 10 and 50 threads is like reasonable. It's like around the idle time that we saw before of like a 1/10 of a second. And then similar behavior with our 4.8 system, our middleweight system. And then with our heavyweight system, we actually saw some increased load times on the Grafana dashboard. So this is 10 threads, 50 threads, and 100 threads. You can see that the first 2 kind of make sense. Like this is almost like twice the height of this first one. So 50 threads over 10, you're going to be burning a lot more cycles on the target endpoint. But the last one, the 100 threads, makes no sense at all. You can tell that there's like some major like issues happening either on the local system or on the target. And the results from the tool actually were not helpful. So next I tested Nuclei. I've really started to like Nuclei recently. It's super fast. Template scanner. It's free. You don't have to pay a ton for it like you do with Nessus. And it's super flexible. You can just go and like find templates, build a profile with them, and then just run it. And it's really good. It's fast. Recently at Black Hills, we've settled on using the Pentest profile, pentest.yaml, as a configuration for Nuclei. And we've done that because if you use like the Nuclei's like cloud deployment scenario, instead of like hosting it yourself, you have them set it up for you and I'm sure pay a fee. They set it up with pentest.yaml. So that's their default. That's the one that we've gone with as the standard. And then I also tested all.yaml, which is a wider set of tests. And this is generally what my command is. Here, I went ahead and just like coupled. So if you look at the legend on the top, it's like 2.4 Nuclei all. That's like the all profile on the lowest like powered server. And then below that is the Pentest profile for the 2.4, and then it's the same for 4 and 8, and then 8 and 16. But what's really cool is you can see that the performance is like coupled together. The lines like for 2.4, you can see the high server response times, and you can see that the contour of the line kind of maps with each other, except for that second spike. And you can see that the graph also down here on the 4 and 8 system, the response times are shorter, but has a similar shape to the graph. Obviously on the 8 and 16 system, the load times are really small. This is what this looks like. So on the system that's getting hit, this is the least powered system. This is the Pentest profile and then the all profile. So whatever the all profile is doing is not doing like a ton more things, right? At least from what I can see. You've got a little bit more width to the graph and you have a little more consumption and run time, but that's about it. They're really similar. They do separate things, but just from like a resource consumption perspective, their contour is really similar. And then I skipped right ahead to like the strongest server just so we can kind of see what the shape of the graph is when it's not clipped by a lightweight system. So, there's 2 peaks on the second. So once again, Pentest and then all. And those 2 peaks kind of in my mind makes me think of the load times that we saw, the server responses. But it does max out at like 70% CPU consumption when you run these on a high-powered server. testssl is a tool that we use to figure out what kind of TLS configurations a server will support. So we can kind of figure out if the web server is configured to accept and secure cryptographic configurations. This is generally the command that I use. And I ran this tool because I wanted to see what was really happening on the host. Really minimal CPU usage here. I mean, we max out at like 10%. And then for network traffic, I mean, this is kilobytes, right? So this is nowhere near what we saw for Nuclei and Nessus. But you do see the traffic and a lot of outbound traffic. It's I took PCAPs from the target side of everything that was happening, and I did some spot checks, but I didn't include it in the presentation. But you can see like configuration of all these different protocols for TLS and SSL. This is kind of when I stopped analyzing testssl. This is a baseline idle from the beginning of the presentation. So the impact on server responses is like indistinguishable from idle performance on the system. So I'm like, okay, this is the weakest server. You know, I don't have to worry about impact, at least in terms of page load times. SSH-audit. SSH-audit is a tool that assesses server and client SSH configurations. In this test scenario, I'm assessing a server, right? And there's a default mode where it's pretty lightweight. It like runs in like 15 seconds. Then there's a denial of service mode that you can run. And of course, I ran both because it's fun. And this is default operation. It's like barely 5% CPU consumption. You see some traffic here on like 15 to 20 kilobytes a second. But this is like really low, and it also follows what a system idle is, so really low performance impact. This is for default configuration. This is for the denial of service mode. As you'd expect, it completely maxes out CPU consumption. Got like 1 megabit a second inbound and outbound network traffic. I let it run for, I guess, like 2.5 minutes, but it had no impact on server response times. So that's what this orange line is. It completely tracks with system idle at like 1/10 of a second. So for some reason, running the denial of service tool, maybe it didn't work on my version of SSH, but it had no impact on server response times. And so finally, Nessus vulnerability scanner. You guys have heard of this. It's a commercial vulnerability scanner. You can deploy it in the cloud. You can also set it up locally. I set it up locally. At Black Hill, we use the basic network scan because it's the industry standard. We configure it to look at all ports. And then we also have it do quick vulnerability checks on web servers. And this is what response times look like. So when you're running Nessus, this is like for the lightweight, medium, and heavyweight servers. You can see on the lightweight server, you're like doubling the response times you would have at idle, which is down here at 1/10 of a second. But everything else is like really close to idle, which is a bit odd. Baseline, yeah, you can't even see it because the performance for our low resourced and medium resource systems are covering it up. When you actually look at the consumption of the system, this is for the 2.4 system, it pegs, this is like the basic network scan, it pegs that system for like 15 minutes. And then you see like 50% consumption before and after. So, I mean, the PCAP for this tool run was like 2.5 gigs. It was massive. And you see a ton of responses from the server, and it just takes a really long time. I mean, look at memory. As you'd expect, though, when you increase the resources of the system, it drives down the percent of CPU utilization. And then when you get up to 8 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM, you're looking at maxing out at like 45 or 50% of CPU. Okay, so observations. It's kind of like my takeaway slide. So with Gobuster, like stay under 100 threads, and you'll generally stay under 3-second server responses based on my testing. And obviously, internet's going to be different. 15 threads has a minimal impact on response times from the test that I did. For Gowitness, like there's no reason why I will ever run 100 threads again on Gowitness. It just completely botched the results from the tool, and it made the results unreliable. Testssl and ssh-audit, I wasn't able to discern like a meaningful impact on like the actual host. So if a client is like, you're running these tools, could they have impacted, our systems and taken down our servers? I would be like, I think that's really remote. Nuclei and Nessus, so their consumption profiles are really similar, but Nuclei, is faster. And so it's like maxing out those systems for a shorter period of time. Even though Nessus isn't necessarily taking those systems to 100% CPU usage, like it's going for like 15 minutes. And it's worth noting though that when I ran Nessus, I targeted a single IP address. I didn't target like say 5. So it could be that when you're running Nessus and you have 5 IP addresses in the input list, that maybe it's spreading that workload across 5 different remote hosts, and it's not as bad, but here it was bad.
Jack, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.